A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Shabbos at the Skitzal.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geberer.
Yehuda Geberer with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is dedicated by the Weinberger family in honor of Mr. Avram Felsenberg, a proud and worthy descendant of the Chasam Sofer, who continues to perpetuate his holy Messiah, wishing him arichas yamim and health on his 75th birthday. So, believe it or not, we haven't really done an episode ever on the Chasam Sofer, which is pretty shocking. Ksav Sofer was such an influential individual who played such a outsized role in modern Jewish history, who's one of those unique individuals that their impact continues to grow with time. Most individuals, their impact diminishes or remains stable with time, and the Ksav Sofer is one of those who his influence continues to grow with time. And it's pretty shocking that we haven't in Jewish History Soundbites gotten to him yet. Him, his story, his world, his times. First of all, his story is long, multifaceted. There's several different angles. It's very interesting. So you'd think we would have touched on some of it at one point. Second of all, he plays a big role in history, both important role, and he's at a specific place at a specific time, a time of change, a time confronting the challenges of modernity, and to do what he did is quite a story. And number three, his legacy, with all of the reality, how he has impacted Orthodoxy in many ways, along with all the mythology and revisionism about the Ksav Sofer's legacy, which I think is quite a story also, what people have used the Ksav Sofer's legacy for their own agendas over the years. That's a very interesting thing. Also, another reason why it's surprising that we haven't had an episode on him yet is that we have quite a few, large percentage of listeners who are proud Hungarians, and the Ksav Sofer is the father of modern traditional Hungarian Jewry, and you'd think that many of these listeners would get up and say, "Hey, let's have a series on the Ksav Sofer." So it's a bit surprising, and so what struck me was that would possibly to answer this was that the podcast sponsorships are a relatively new medium. So since the Ksav Sofer was the one who stood for Chodesh Asur Min HaTorah, so then no one wants to get up and sponsor an episode about the Ksav Sofer. So maybe that's why. I'm just kidding. Either way, taken together, it's really long overdue. I'd love to do a series on the Ksav Sofer, and I'm sure many of our listeners would as well. So I want to take this opportunity to say that it's a great story for a multi-part series. His life, his times, his world, his influence, his legacy. So contact me for sponsorships, Yehuda at yehudageber.com, and I hope that we have many, many more episodes about the Chasam Sofer. So I'm glad that we're able to start with the story of him and his family. Of course, it's on the trips to Europe. He's definitely one of the most frequent stops. It's very convenient. It's right outside Vienna. So we always go to his kever. It's quite often. It's from the airport from the Vienna airport to his gravesite. It's a half hour, 40 minutes tops, and it's very popular. It's sometimes the highlight of the trip for many times. There's a new Hachnasas Orchim there when we go, just recently opened. It's also very exciting to go there because the whole way where it was preserved, the old Jewish cemetery was almost destroyed during the war, and miraculously, with great Mesiris Nefesh from members of the Bratislava Jewish community during it wasn't Nazi occupation, it was a Slovakian collaborationist regime, so it's different than direct Nazi occupation. That's probably how they were able to pull it off, but they were able to succeed, even though most of the cemetery was destroyed, but they were able to succeed in preserving the Ksav Sofer's section of the cemetery underground, actually. So you kind of like go into this cave underground to go to it. It adds to the aura and the atmosphere of like you're going to the Ksav Sofer. It's like you're spelunking into the, Actually, I spoke to older people who went 30 years ago, and it was really climbing underground. Now it's more organized. You walk in through this tunnel. Either way, so it's fun to go to his kever as well. This episode will focus on one of the many facets of his story. I'll try to do a brief overview of the Chasam Sofer's biography, just a short, actually the steps of his life and where he was rabbi and so on. I'm not going to delve into any point of that this time because I'm hoping that we have a future opportunity to do so. What I would like to focus is on his family, and I'll explain why. A few points are in order when we discuss the Chasam Sofer's family. Number one, every Hungarian that I know thinks they're an anicle of the Chasam Sofer. Every single trip, without exception, about half the bus sidles over to me at some point and confides with much pride that what he thinks makes him completely unique because he's convinced that no one else in the world has this distinction, and he quietly says to me with a twinkle in their eye, I'm an anicle, or an einikel. A lot of them say einikel. And sometimes it's even true. Sometimes they're actually einiklach. And it's definitely a sense of pride. It just happens to be that half the world is. That doesn't diminish the pride that anyone can have. And it's justified to have such yichus to the Chasam Sofer is a beautiful thing, and I wish I did, and I'm kind of jealous. So the Chasam Sofer had this enormous family with thousands of descendants by now, and many survived the Holocaust or got out before, although many definitely fell victim and were killed in the Holocaust as well, so it would have, potentially it's even bigger. There are quite a few descendants of the Ksav Sofer running around. There's this famous joke that people say, I mean, I never repeat it, of course, but people have said it on trips, that there was this museum in Hungary or Slovakia or whatever, one of those areas, that there was a Hungarian Jew as an exhibit. So someone said, what is this? Why do you have this Hungarian Jew as an exhibit? So they said, well, this is the only Hungarian Jew we found who's not an anicle of the Chasam Sofer, so we decided to put him as an exhibit because it's a unique status. That's, of course, in good humor. But so that's one thing. Since that there's such a large family out there and such a legacy, and many prominent members of this family have also left an impact, so I wanted to discuss about it as well, just not in a genealogical sense, but more in a historical sense, to trace it through the generations, to understand what type of army the Chasam Sofer created just from his family. By the way, his students are a big part of his legacy also, but that's another story. In fact, that's another interesting story, because one of the Chasam Sofer's more famous students was Reb Hillel Lichtenstein. They sometimes refer to him as Reb Hillel Kolomaya, because he was the rabbi in the town of Kolomaya. And he was a very fiery individual, a fighter, an extremist in many ways, and he was not happy with what he perceived as a moderate stance taken by members of the Chasam Sofer's family. He felt that the true legacy of the Chasam Sofer was by the Chasam Sofer's students, such as himself, and not through his family, the Ksav Sofer, his son, who the Reb Hillel Lichtenstein felt was was being too moderate. He felt that the Ksav Sofer was being too moderate. He said, who's the real family? The real family is his students. He said a whole thing about it. And of course, that's always the question: is his descendants the core of his legacy, or is it his students, or is it a combination of both? Or do we ask the people who see themselves as continuing his legacy whether there's an objective truth to it or not? Because who says there is an objective truth to it? And anyone who perceives themselves as a follower of the Chasam Sofer, regardless of his familial status or student status, they can justifiably claim the crown of being continuing that tradition. So it's always very much in dispute, and each uses it to their understanding and to fit their own agenda. For instance, the way the Hasidic community, especially Hungarian Hasidim, have engaged in revisionism over the last century or so, to retroactively make the Chasam Sofer into a Chassid or a Rabbi, because the Oberland Hungarian Jewish community has, pretty much disappeared by now, and the Hungarian Hasidic community adopted the Chasam Sofer, and the issue is the Chasam Sofer came from Frankfurt and was from Ashkenaz and Yeki and Oberland, and so we have to fix that. So we have to change his top hat, which he wore as a rabbi in Pressburg, a stovepipe top hat, and it was referred to as a cylinder at that time, and we have to redraw the picture with a shtreimel. He has to be wearing a shtreimel. So that's things like that. But that's of course another story as well. The Chasam Sofer's influence in his own lifetime didn't go beyond the Hungary, Austria, Slovakia area. Definitely never reached Poland, Lithuania, Russia, where the majority of the world Jewish population lived. They may have heard of him, but not much of an influence, almost zero influence or impact in those areas. So it only grew beyond his spectrum of influence after the war, when his legacy came to define the boundaries of ultra-Orthodoxy and the rebuilding after the war in Israel, to a certain extent in the United States as well. So like I said, his impact grows with time. So that's really, really a testimony to his the strength of his legacy and his convictions and his teachings. So between his large and prestigious family and his principal students, they dominated rabbinic life of the countries of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and later the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, right up until the war. So it's definitely a very, very good story. So just a basic overview of the Chasam Sofer's biography, the time period that he lived, the phases of his life, the positions that he had. He was one of the most influential and fascinating personalities of modern Jewish history. In many ways, one of the primary shapers of traditional Jewish life in the modern era. He's referred to often as the father of Orthodoxy or the founder of Orthodoxy, because there's a big misconception out there that Orthodoxy in the modern era is basically a continuation of traditional Jewish life of the pre-modern era. It's simply not the case. It's not true, and it can be easily demonstrated in many ways. The pre-modern era, you could be a traditional Jew living an observant Jewish life, following the Torah and mitzvos in a traditional sense, but that's not Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy was the confrontation of the Jewish community with the modern world, the changing world in a political sense, technology, changing economies, emancipation, all these external influences, and to a much lesser extent internal changes also, but that had much less of an impact on traditional Jewish life. It was much more the external influences, which I've mentioned before. And Orthodoxy develops mechanisms of response, new institutions, new responses, new ways of dealing with halacha and custom, minhag, leadership, organization, media, political organization, education, yeshivas, eventually girls' education, new emphasis on their spiritual life in the Hasidic world and the yeshiva world, Musar movement, neo-Orthodoxy in Germany and other areas. So all these are the responses of traditional Jewish life to the challenges that they were confronting in the modern era. And therefore Orthodoxy is a new phenomenon. It's a product of modernity. So it's what's fascinating about it is that you have a conservative lifestyle, which is essentially a modern movement, which is, a fascinating story. And the Chasam Sofer is one of the defining figures of that, and he's one of the first ones as well. He understood it probably better than anyone else, and he created a coherent system and answers and responses earlier than everyone else, and that's what makes him so great and influential. He took real initiative, real leadership, and did what he did, and that's what makes him such an important figure in history, which is something we'll perhaps explore more in future episodes. So we always call him the Chasam Sofer, but he actually had a name. His name was Rav Moshe Sofer, or Schreiber. He came from a family of Sofrim, so they were either called Sofer in Hebrew or Schreiber in German. He was born in Frankfurt in Germany, in Western Germany, in 1762. And he's a student of the local rabbi, Rav Pinchas Horovitz, the Haflah. But his primary teacher, to whom he was devoted his entire life and shaped his outlook, was Rav Nosson Adler, who was also a fascinating figure, and for a later, also discuss him later on when we talk about the Chasam Sofer further. The Chasam Sofer also studied nearby in Mainz for a period of time, and during his couple of years that he left Frankfurt for Mainz, before his return to Frankfurt, his curriculum in Mainz included general studies, math, astronomy, history, other subjects. Later on in life, he'd even hire private tutors to teach his own children, the Ksav Sofer, Rav Shimon Sofer, all his children, general studies of those that I mentioned and similar subjects, including languages as well, because he felt it was important. And he didn't see anything fundamentally wrong with general studies. He was a fighter against modernity and how to confront those challenges and how it was having an adverse effect on traditional Jewish norms, but that didn't mean that there was something fundamentally wrong with general knowledge per se, which was an interesting distinction that he himself made. When he was about 20 years old, he left Frankfurt with his teacher, Rav Nosson Adler, as a result of the latter's activities in Frankfurt with the establishment, the Kahal and the rabbinate, viewed with askance. This whole story of Rav Nosson Adler and his mysticism and his group that he had of his students and the customs that he had. The Chasam Sofer never returned to his hometown. He never went back to Frankfurt. He was a teacher in Prusnitz for several years, and he was a rabbi of Dresnitz in 1794. A few years later, in 1798, he was appointed to the rabbinate of Mattersdorf in Burgenland, and he remained there for nearly a decade. He had a yeshiva there as well. In 1807, he becomes the rabbi of Pressburg. Later on, that's known as Bratislava, which is it's known today. And he remained there for the rest of his life. 33 years he was the rabbi there until his passing in 1839. He had a lot of positions. He was the community rabbi of a very large and prestigious community. He was a rosh yeshiva of a yeshiva that he founded, very large and important, and one of the most important yeshivas in the world, the Pressburg yeshiva, and he was an educator. He actually viewed himself as an educator. He saw that as his primary profession. He also was a world-renowned posek in halacha. When he wrote Chuvas and Paskin on Shilas to decide for all over the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Although at the time the Av Bezdin, the head of the rabbinical court in Pressburg for half a century, from before he arrived until several years after his passing, was someone else. It was Reb Daniel Prushtitz, who was a very, very important figure, very close with the Chasam Sofer for all the years. He was an interesting personality. We'll have to get back to him sometime in the future. He's buried next to him in that underground cave. The Chasam Sofer is also the author of an almost unparalleled number of works covering the length and breadth of every conceivable area of Torah, mysticism, drush, everything. Literally covers everything. He was also, and perhaps his greatest component of his legacy is that he was a real and true leader of the Jewish people on a national stage. He took initiative, responsibility, responded to the times. That's the most famous part, and what needs to be explored most in depth. The slogan that is attributed to him, what that means, put some nuance and perspective to it. What exactly was he up against? What was the context of that time? What was going on in Germany and Hungary at the time? A lot of that needs to be discussed, but now we're going to focus on him and on his family. So let's move over to his family, actually. His first marriage was, when he was a young man, was to Sarah Malka, the daughter of a fellow by the name of Rav Moshe Sofer of Prushnitz. The Ksav Sofer was in his 20s when he got married. It seems like it was in the late 1780s that he was in his first marriage, and he did not have any children from his first wife. They were married for well over 20 years and never had children. In 1812, his wife passed away. He was already the rabbi of Pressburg for about 5 years at this time. So here he is at the pinnacle of his career. No children. His wife passed away. He's at this prestigious rabbinical position, very famous already. And he marries a second time. He marries the recently widowed daughter of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, also one of the greatest rabbinical figures of the day, who was then the rabbi of Poznan in the Prussian area of Poland. And Rabbi Akiva Eiger and the Chasam Sofer were very close. They were less than a year apart. And Rabbi Akiva Eiger's daughter, Sarah, I guess it's a diminutive of Sarah, she was 22 years old. Her first husband was a Rav Moshe Sofer, who was only 24 when he passed away. And this shidduch was arranged with the Ksav Sofer. And she married the Ksav Sofer in 1813 in the city of Eisenstadt. In fact, the story is told, I don't know if it's true, that she told her father, Rabbi Akiva Eiger, when they're about to walk down to the chuppah, she turns to her father and said, "But he's so old." And Rabbi Akiva Eiger says to his daughter, "Sarah, he's getting older every second. Run quickly." So that's what they say. Again, you never know if these stories are true, but it gives a sense of the greatness of this family. All of the Chasam Sofer's children were from this marriage. There were 4 sons and 7 daughters. A few of them, unfortunately, as was common at the time, died when they were young, children, babies. But all of his children came from this marriage. In 1832, Sarah passed away after they were married for close to 20 years. In 1835, a few years later, he married for a third time Chaya Heller from a prominent Galicia family. She had been married to Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Heller, who was a rabbi in Galicia, later moved to Hungary. Again, they were both elderly at this time, so they did not have any children. So all of his children are Einiklach of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Yet, strangely enough, whenever you speak to the Einiklach of the Chasam Sofer, you primarily hear from them their yichus to the Chasam Sofer, much less so to Rabbi Akiva Eiger. But that's the way it works. That's the ebb and flow of life. So the oldest son of the Chasam Sofer is famously Rav Shmuel ben Yamin Sofer, known as the Ksav Sofer, and he succeeded his father as the rabbi of Pressburg and as the rosh yeshiva of the prominent yeshiva in Pressburg. When the yeshiva actually reaches its full glory under the Ksav Sofer, and interestingly enough, he remains at the stewardship of both the yeshiva and the community for 33 years, exactly like his father. The yeshiva at this time doubles its student body and numbered in the hundreds, producing rabbis, community rabbis and rosh yeshiva across the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Within a generation or two, almost all rabbis across the Austro-Hungarian Empire were products of the Pressburg yeshiva system. Incredible impact so quickly. The Ksav Sofer, like I mentioned earlier, was considered relatively moderate. Again, you have to take the word relatively importantly. And he even entertained the idea of neo-orthodoxy in Hungary. Wow. We usually assume that was exclusively in Germany. The Ksav Sofer toyed with the idea of implementing that in Hungary as well, along the lines that Rabbi Israel Hildesheimer was already doing at that time. And he was in Hungary, in Eisenstadt. Later on, he moved to Berlin. And the Ksav Sofer also employed a Maggid to deliver sermons in German in Pressburg, which caused quite a stir because that was in the vernacular. That was heretical to have something in the vernacular. Of course, if you have your community rabbi who delivers his sermon in English from the pulpit, then you can assume that it's definitely not an Orthodox synagogue. But of course, things have changed by the 21st century. I'm just kidding. But at that time, he was denounced by the more conservative students of his father for being too moderate because he had hired someone to preach in German. He was not extreme enough in his opposition to the growing and emerging neolog movement in Hungary. That's what he was accused of. He passed away in 1871. He was also a prolific author, many Sfarim. He's buried in the new cemetery, the new Jewish cemetery, further up the mountain where the Ksav Sofer is. When we go with the groups, we try to have time to climb up further up to the new cemetery, which is not destroyed. It's a big, beautiful cemetery, and that's where the Ksav Sofer and some other prominent individuals are buried. Another son of the Ksav Sofer was Rav Shimon Sofer, who was only 19 when his father passed away. He was a rabbi in Mattersdorf, where his father had been rabbi for a time. So the Rav Shimon Sofer was a rabbi there for 18 years, and in 1861 he was appointed to the rabbinate of Krakow. So here you have a member of the family reaching Galicia, Poland, essentially, but the Galicia part of Poland, where he remained for 22 years until his passing in 1883. We go to his grave also in the new Krakow Jewish cemetery, just outside the old Jewish quarter of Krakow, on our visits to Krakow. Rav Shimon Sofer took a very active stance in the leadership of the broader community in Galicia. Together with the Belzer Rebbe, Reb Sheila, they founded the first Orthodox political party, possibly in history. They named it Machziki Hadas, and they had a newspaper even, Kol Machziki Hadas, again in the 1860s and 70s. This is very, very unique and forward-looking. The Rav Shimon Sofer, in fact, was the first Orthodox Jew elected to the Austrian Parliament in Vienna in 1879. And he even met the Emperor Franz Josef. He was involved in activities promoting settling the Holy Land. He was a fascinating individual as well. There was another son of Chasam Sofer, interesting story. Rabbi Yosef Yuzpa Sofer, who was a businessman, and tragically, a very, very tragic story, he was eventually murdered in an incident. It seemed to be like a business related, someone who owed him a debt or something. I didn't get the whole story. Very, very sad, but he's another branch of the family. His widow moved to Satmar, so their descendants moved over to that part of the world. There was another few children who died young. There was a son, Yitzchak Leib, a daughter named Esther. Others, there was another daughter named Gittel. Her husband was Rabbi Leo Kornitzer. He passed away in his 20s, and his children, who married cousins into the family, they became, the Kornitzers became prominent descendants of the Chasam Sofer. They were rabbis in Krakow right up until the war. But she remarried, this Gittel, remarried Reb Shlomo Zalman Spitzer. Reb Shlomo Zalman Spitzer eventually was in Vienna, and he was in charge of the legendary Schiff Shul in Vienna. It was a very famous shul. It was the center of the Oberland Chasam Sofer style Hungarian community in the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Reb Shlomo Zalman Spitzer was this essentially son-in-law of the Chasam Sofer who ran it for many years, and his descendants as well. So you have the Kornitzer and Spitzer families who are descendants too. There was another daughter named Hindel, and her husband was Reb David Tzvi Ehrenfelds. So the Ehrenfelds, who again are associated with Mattersdorf, but they're descendants of the Chasam Sofer as well. The Ehrenfelds, the Glasner branches of the Chasam Sofer's family come from this daughter. There was Yutel, who was her husband was Yisrael Geiger. There was another daughter named Reisel, but I think she passed away young also. There was a daughter named Reichel, whose husband was Tzvi Yehuda Friedman. There's and so on and so forth. The youngest daughter was named Simcha. She was the youngest daughter of the Chasam Sofer, the youngest child, I believe, of the Chasam Sofer. She lived a very long life. She passed away in 1911. So imagine in the early 1900s, there was still a child of the Chasam Sofer around. This is 70 plus years after her father had passed away. Incredible. Her husband was Ramesha Tuvia Lehman. So that's another branch. But if we move on, they continue to have an influence in generation after generation. You have the children of the Ksav Sofer. He had quite a few children. The two famous sons were Reb Simcha Bunim Sofer, the Shevet Sofer, who succeeded him as rabbi and rosh yeshiva in Pressburg. He passed away in 1906 in Frankfurt when he was visiting there to receive medical care, and the Frankfurt community wanted him to be buried there, which would have been interesting because it would have been coming full circle, a Sofer, a grandson of Chasam Sofer, being buried in the Chasam Sofer's original hometown, but that didn't materialize, and they returned him to Pressburg, Bratislava, essentially at that time, to be buried next to his father, the Ksav Sofer, in the cemetery on top the mountain, like I said before. He was succeeded by his son, Rabbi Sofer, who was the last rabbi and rosh yeshiva of Pressburg, in Pressburg, when it was already Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia. He was a fascinating individual. He was independently quite wealthy. He owned shares in the Romanian oil fields, which was quite a lucrative investment at the time. So he never took a salary from the Bratislava Jewish community, and he instead supported Torah scholars in the increasingly secularized the community, Bratislava community. He wanted to enhance the Torah community. He lived through very changing times. In 1939, following the Nazi takeover of Czechoslovakia and the installation of a fascist collaborationist puppet regime in Slovakia, Rabbi Sofer escaped to Switzerland and from there to Palestine, and he renounced any rabbinic career aspirations at that time and declared that he wants to live as a simple Jew in Yerushalayim. He did found the Pressburg yeshiva in Givat Shaul in Yerushalayim, but it did not actually, it didn't really achieve the renown or the prestige of its antecedent in Europe, unfortunately. He and many other members of the Sofer family were prominent in the Agudas Yisrael, very active in Agudas Yisrael. He passed away in 1959. He had a fascinating son-in-law. One of his son-in-laws was a fellow by the name of Philip Freudiger, who was the head of the Orthodox community in Budapest, and he served in a very controversial role during the Holocaust, which is a great story on its own merit. Hopefully we'll get to that one day, his involvement in the Kastner train and who he was able to get on it and who he didn't get on it, and the information that he received from Reb Michal Ber Weissmandel, the Verba Wetzler, Auschwitz protocols, and what he chose to do or not to do with that information, and his testimony at the Eichmann trial, which caused a big to-do in the courtroom, and a whole very interesting story. It's a lot of fun stuff. We'll have to save that for another time. There was another son of the Ksav Sofer named Rav Shimon Sofer. He was the rabbi of the town of Eger in Hungary for 64 years. That's got to be one of the longest rabbinical careers in one place in history. It's right near Miskolc, and for those who don't know where that is, it's about an hour and a half drive to the west of Kerestir, since that would help people place it easier. The Jews referred to it, as was their custom, by its German name, Erlau or Erloi. He had 15 children, the majority of whom were killed in the Holocaust, including him. He was 94 years old when the Nazis invaded Hungary and when he was deported to Auschwitz and he was killed there in the gas chambers. Imagine that. Grandson of Chasam Sofer, great tzaddik, 94 years old, killed in Auschwitz in the gas chambers. One of his surviving grandchildren was Rabbi Yochanan Sofer, who eventually moved to Israel and established the Erloi community in Katamon, Yerushalayim, who's also a fascinating story in his own right, because Erloi kind of evolved into a Hasidic court. Rabbi Yochanan Sofer was, of course, close with the Belzer Rebbe, so that had an influence there. But since he was also a descendant of the Chasam Sofer, he retained elements of the Oberland Ashkenaz, including the Nusach that they daven is Ashkenaz. So you have this Ashkenaz Hasidic court. So it's like this, a little bit of dissonance there. But at the same time, that's just a couple of famous children of the Ksav Sofer. The Ksav Sofer had several other children who were not as famous. In fact, the oldest ones were not his successors. They deferred to their younger siblings. His oldest son was named Rabbi Yaakov Akiva Sofer, and he turned down the opportunity to succeed his father. He felt he was too physically weak, he had some health issues, and he was not able to undertake this burden and responsibility. He resided in the town of Miava, which is north of Bratislava, near the Czech border. His daughter, Rosa, married a wealthy Vienna banker and communal activist in the Vienna Orthodox community named Avram or Adolf Felsenberg. Their son, Rabbi Moshe Felsenberg, was one of the rebuilders of Oberland in the post-war United States with his activities in the Vienna community and the Nitra community. He was very involved in that, in those places. To make it relevant to contemporary listeners, especially people like me who have, ancient roots in Muncie. So the legendary educator for Monsey, Reb Hershel Mashinsky of blessed memory, who I was privileged to know when I was growing up. He was married to the daughter of Reb Menachem Moshe Felsenberg. The Ksav Sofer had many other children. There was the children of Rav Shimon Sofer, that rabbi from Krakow, who I mentioned earlier. His nephew, Rabbi Akiva Kornitzer, became his son-in-law, and the Kornitzer family were prominent Krakow rabbis until the war. Another branch of this family moved to Warsaw, and there in Warsaw, in the middle of Poland, you had descendants of the Chasam Sofer. So at least one branch made it all the way out of Hungary, all the way to Warsaw before the war. So you have this incredible dynasty, as it were, and that's the basic idea of who the Chasam Sofer was and his family. And I hope that we have the opportunity in the future to have more episodes devoted to the story, to really get into the real story of the Chasam Sofer, about his leadership and his position in Pressburg and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire through that time, through that changing times and the challenges that he confronted along the way. So this is Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.